Three skeletons are tending what appears to be a lost garden in the middle of a forest. One of them gently embraces a flower, another waters the plants, and finally, one simply turns his back to us. This painting is called The Garden of Death and was painted in 1896 by Hugo Simberg, an artist we recently explored on the channel. But the most mysterious thing about this image is not that we see three skeletons taking care of a garden, but what it truly represents. For the artist, these skeletons symbolize death, but from a perspective we had never seen before in any other painting. In fact, the meaning of this work is so profound that, at the time, the image became widely known in Finland and was even reproduced as a fresco in one of the country's most important cathedrals. But why? What could three skeletons lovingly tending a garden possibly represent? For centuries, European art has constructed a very clear image of death. Death usually appears as a skeleton, as a reaper, or as a presence that drags the living toward their end. For many years, death has been seen as the force that interrupts life, that reminds us how fragile the human body is, and that, at the same time, imposes equality between rich and poor, between kings and beggars. This vision became especially strong in the medieval tradition and has remained alive for a long time. Just think of the Danse Macabre, where death carries everyone away without distinction, or the many religious images in which the figure of the skeleton serves as a reminder of the transience of the flesh, punishment, or the nearness of the grave. That is the visual language we have all inherited, even if we are not consciously aware of it. Even before I told you that these skeletons represent death, I'm sure you had already made that association simply by seeing a skeleton. And that is completely natural, because for centuries we have been conditioned to connect that same figure with the same idea. And it is precisely for that reason that this painting feels so intriguing. In this work, Simberg does not remove that symbol. He does not replace death with an abstract figure, nor with a difficult to recognize allegory. He keeps exactly the same form we all associate with death, but what changes completely is its behavior. Instead of chasing someone, the skeletons we see in this painting are tending a garden, and that contrast unsettles the viewer from the very first moment, because our eyes recognize the symbol, but the scene does not match what we expect to see. And that is where the true strangeness of this work begins to emerge, because we are not seeing death as the enemy of humanity, but as part of a more complex process. It invites us to see death not as a force that simply destroys, but as a presence that also accompanies, and that breaks with entire centuries of tradition. We must remember that within symbolism, an image is never there just for its appearance. Artists of this period painted every element to express a deeper idea. So if Simberg chooses to portray death as a gardener, it is not a random or eccentric decision. It is a deliberate choice that helps us understand his personal way of seeing the transition between life and death. Now, one of the first things that stands out when we begin to analyze the painting is that we are not looking at a single skeleton, but three. This immediately changes the feeling of the scene. It no longer feels like death interrupting a specific moment, but rather performing a routine task, something almost part of its everyday existence. And this is also reflected in the attitude of the figures. None of them is doing anything unusual. One gently holds a flower, another waters the plants, and the third stands with his back turned, as if quietly focused on his own task. Everything in the scene conveys a very strange sense of calm, because even though we are looking at skeletons, they behave in a way that is completely opposite to what we would expect. It is also important to pay attention to the act of watering, because watering is not just any gesture. It implies caring for something that is still growing. It implies sustaining something fragile, and above all, it requires patience. And that is precisely what makes it so significant, because it transforms death into a figure that does not simply end life, but participates in its care. And that leads us directly to the flowers, which are the symbolic center of the entire image. At first glance, we might think they are just decorative plants within this strange garden, but in reality, everything revolves around them. The only interpretation we have of this painting, given by Simberg himself, is that these plants represent the souls of each person before entering heaven. And that completely changes the way we see the painting. Because if the flowers are souls, then this is not an ordinary garden. It becomes a kind of waiting place, an intermediate space where souls have not yet reached their final destination and, in the meantime, are being cared for by death itself. That explains perfectly why the scene conveys tranquility instead of fear. In almost any other painting, a skeleton in the middle of a forest would feel threatening, but here, it is the opposite. It is as if Simberg wanted to show us that death does not always have to be seen through fear or violence, but also as a transition, a preparation for what comes next. And finally, there is one detail I find essential: the skeleton with its back turned. By painting one of the figures facing away from us, the artist makes the scene feel even more natural within its own world. That is precisely why this painting gives the impression that we are witnessing something that is usually hidden. Looking at it feels as if the painting allows us, for just a moment, to glimpse a place that does not fully belong to the world of the living. But even taking all of this into account, one of the biggest questions surrounding this work still remains. Why would an image with such a profound message end up displayed on the walls of one of Finland's most important cathedrals? Could this message be contradictory to Christian beliefs? Before answering that question, I'd like to remind you that if you'd like to have this piece in your own collection, it is now available in our catalogue. The Garden of Death, along with more than 900 historical artworks from different artists, is available for you to choose your favorites and start building your own art collection. Shipping is free worldwide, and by purchasing from the store, you'll be supporting me in continuing to create videos every week. I'll leave the link in the description so you can place your order once you finish watching the video. Now, let's continue. Hugo Simberg painted the frescoes of the Tampere Cathedral at the beginning of the 20th century, and his images drew attention from the very start. His paintings were not the typical religious scenes people expected to find in a space like this. There is no clear iconography, no direct biblical narrative. What Simberg brought into this cathedral was a much more symbolic language, more ambiguous, and of course more unsettling for the faithful who came there to pray. For that reason, the reception of his work was controversial for a large part of the public. But that does not necessarily mean that this work breaks with Christian beliefs. As part of the symbolist movement, Simberg did not express ideas in a conventional way. Because if we think about it, this image does not contradict some of the most important themes within Christianity. The Christian narrative also speaks about the soul, the passage between life and death, waiting, salvation, and what lies beyond the visible world, and that is precisely what this scene seems to represent. Seen outside of a church, this image may appear simply strange, but seen within a cathedral, it gains a much deeper meaning. The work stops feeling like an unsettling fantasy and begins to function as a spiritual reflection. The skeletons are no longer just macabre figures, but part of a higher order, as if they were fulfilling a role within that transition of the soul that Christianity has been trying to explain for centuries. If we accept Simberg's interpretation that these flowers represent souls waiting before entering heaven, then the scene no longer feels out of place within a religious setting. On the contrary, it engages with it in a very powerful way. What Simberg ultimately did with this painting was take a deeply spiritual idea and represent it in a way we had never seen before. I would love to read your opinion about this painting in the comments. Do you think this work belongs in such an important cathedral, or do you believe that a message like this contradicts Christian tradition? Thank you for making it to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.